I'd like to give kind of a detailed list of a few of the other significant contributions of Augustine to the church. And I truly believe that Augustine pretty much shaped the intellectual tradition of Christianity until the time of Thomas Aquinas. First, although one might find this idea in some early Jewish writings and even some hints of it within the New Testament, it was really Augustine who developed and refined the Christian doctrine of original sin. Now, I'm not saying he pulled it together out of his head. There's a long tradition that he is himself interpreting and developing and rearranging. But we really can trace this very important Christian idea to Augustine and his influence. Very simply, it's the argument that the disobedience of the first man and the first woman in the Garden of Eden resulted in a taint, a curse, a blot on the souls of that first man and women, which they passed on to every other member of the human race. That all humans, because of the disobedience of Adam and Eve, have on them the taint of sin and cannot, therefore, in any way successfully approach God on their own. That this taint of sin has suffused itself throughout the human soul, and every single part of a human being is under the consequences and the judgment and condemnation of sin from birth. And this is why at the beginning of the Confessions, he spends so much time trying to demonstrate that even when he was a baby, he was mean and selfish. He's arguing for the pervasive influence of the human sin. And this comes to a very broad idea of salvation he has, which is the freely unmerited gift of salvation through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Second contribution, I've alluded to this already, is that Augustine was driven by his passionate concern for what we call in theology the problem of evil. If God is both good and all-powerful, then why does evil still exist in the world? And this is why he went to the Manichaeans, and the Manichaeans explained it. Well, the reason there's evil in the world is because there's an evil God who has significant power in the world. And really, anytime you hear any group, whether they're Christians or some other religious group, and they talk about the world as if it's these two relatively equal forces of good and evil that are locked against each other, well, you're pretty much talking about a Manichaean idea. Ultimately, that idea did not satisfy Augustine because it didn't give a proper, sufficiently majestic place to the absolute God. It was a bitheism rather than a monotheism. And he had been trained monotheistically from the time he was raised and catechized, taught religiously by his mother. So then he was drawn to Neoplatonism, and in Neoplatonism he found an answer to the problem of evil that satisfied him. Because the Neoplatonism says that God is the only absolute, and things only take their existence from their participation in this absolute. Well, then you say God must be the author of evil because evil exists. No, Augustine says, evil does not exist. Rather, he claims evil is the corruption of good. And so, therefore, God is not accountable for the evil. It's the corruption of something good that God made that we recognize as evil. That evil has no positive existence of its own, but is just the corruption of something good. Now, if that confuses you a little bit, don't be surprised. Frankly, it confuses me a whole lot. But this is the argument, the answer to the problem of evil that satisfies Augustine. Does it satisfy you? The third important contribution of Augustine is to what's called the Pelagian controversy. Pelagius was a Christian monk from Great Britain in the late 4th century, and he taught that human beings make a contribution to their own salvation. He taught that human beings, by their response to the gracious offering of salvation from God, in fact, must necessarily take some part in their own salvation. Do you see the logic of that? They have to respond, and that's what they do. This appalled Augustine, because he saw the Pelagian view as not giving sufficient credence to the problem of evil, not giving sufficient credence to original sin, that to imagine that human beings by themselves could in any way even approach God the smallest little bit. And throughout his career, Augustine seriously attacked the Pelagian controversy, both in his writings and in administrative decisions. Finally, and I think this is most important, is that Augustine and the movement that he represents, and I would also include the other Christian Neoplatonists such as Ambrose, they brought Greek philosophy, Greek categories of thought into the church. They baptized Greek philosophy. And the church and the theologians of the church and even the pastors and the bishops who governed the church began to think using Greek absolute theological philosophical categories, and that became the dominant mode of thought within the church through most of its history.